You probably have a lot of questions about psychology. You may have as many questions as you do opinions. Why and how do certain smells elicit strong memories? Are lie detector tests reliable? What effect is technology having on how our brains function? Would you know how to find answers to your questions? It's one of the most important aspects of scientific research, generating interesting questions and finding ways to answer them. Let's say we want to test the hypothesis that sleep deprivation affects cognitive performance.
For any experiment, there must be an independent variable, in this case, hours of sleep per night, as well as a dependent variable, in this case, performance on a standardized test. There must also be at least two groups, a control group and an experimental group. Study participants are randomly assigned to one of these groups. That means each participant has an equal chance of being assigned to the control group as to the experimental group. More importantly, it ensures an equal distribution of the participants' characteristics so that the groups can be considered equivalent before the experiment begins. In our sleep deprivation experiment, participants assigned to the control group are allowed to sleep 8 hours per night for a week, while those assigned to the experimental group are awakened after just 4 hours per night for a week. In every other way, conditions for the two groups are identical. They eat at the same time. During the test, they're exposed to the same environmental conditions, and then they're tested for cognitive performance at the same time. If researchers observe any differences in test performance between the two groups, they can be confident that these were due to the independent variable sleep and not any other factor.
So, what if your questions were about trust? Why we consider some people more trustworthy than others? How trust influences behavior? What factors influence our ability to trust? How would you design a study to answer these questions?
I'm here at Claremont Graduate University talking with Dr. Paul Zak, who is the director of the Center for Neuroeconomic Studies. And I just cheated, actually. I looked on your shirt. Right. I'm glad it was there because that's kind of a mouthful. All right, so let me just ask you, what kind of research do you do here, and how did you kind of get started with it?
So about 10 years ago, I started thinking about these sort of small issues that people haven't thought too much about, like, are human beings good or evil? Now, you know that is a big question that many people have thought about through the ages. Many psychologists have thought about. Okay, so good and evil, that's a big topic. So I want to narrow it down and ask, why would we ever engage in virtuous behaviors? For example, like being trustworthy. Someone trusts you, why not just run away with all the cash? Okay, so when we started doing this, we thought, well, the problem with the research to date is that it's really retrospective. It's about how do you feel, what have you done, did you ever volunteer to help somebody? We want to make it an active task. The open question from human behavior was, why would you ever trust a stranger? Okay. And so we had to do a couple interesting things to design an experiment to study this. One is, how do we measure trust in the lab? And the second is, how do we interrogate the brain to find out what's going on? Because people do not tell us clearly why they're doing what they're doing in many laboratory studies. So this was a birth of an area now known as neuroeconomics. The economic part is, I'm going to put money on the table and in a real way see if you trust a stranger in that money, and I can get a measure of trust. And if you're trusted, you can then reciprocate the trust you've been shown and share some money back. The money grows if you trust somebody. So we took blood before and after these people made decisions, and we had a particular target chemical in the brain called oxytocin. So what does oxytocin do? It connects us to others emotionally. It makes us feel empathy, makes us care about strangers, makes us care about our family too. But it's really this hormone, this chemical of connection. So I call it the moral molecule because it connects us to other people, and when we're connected, we're nicer to them. So synthetic oxytocin exists, and we developed a nasal inhaler in which we can infuse oxytocin into the human brain. Yeah, you sniff it, and it gets into your brain. After about an hour, you have enough in there to affect behavior. And we showed that when we manipulate oxytocin pharmacologically, we can cause people to trust strangers using this exchange of money task much more than people who got a placebo.
Let's talk a little bit about scientific methodology.
One study doesn't prove anything, and it's just a foundation to ask decisions. So this oxytocin work was brand new. No one was studying this behaviorally at all, and so we were careful to run many of these sessions of these experiments, generate a really big sample size, so we had lots of people who did this, and we really had confidence that this was the mapping we were looking for between trust and oxytocin. Having said that, we had to go further. We had to say, okay, once I have this relationship, it's just a correlation. It just means those things run together. It doesn't mean that A causes B. So to get that causal relationship, That's
Gotta
what we
go
had to
deeper,
manipulate.
okay.
Yeah, we had to manipulate oxytocin levels in the brain. So all scientific studies don't require that. We're still using the scientific method if we stopped with the blood work. But we want to go further and do this sort of gold standard study, which is direct manipulation of this brain chemistry.
So, okay, how about in the context of your own research, describe what independent and dependent variables are.
Right, so the independent variables are the thing that you're using to explain a dependent variable. So in this case, we want to explain why someone would ever be trustworthy. Mm-hmm. You got a pile of money in front of you, why would you share it back to the person who trusted you? Why wouldn't you just hightail it out of the lab and leave? So the thing we want to explain, a dependent variable, was trustworthiness. And the thing that we thought would explain it would be oxytocin. Now the key issue there is control, as I said before. Mm-hmm. So it's not just oxytocin, it's oxytocin controlling for things like age and gender and personality type. Again, those things didn't matter much, but we have to ask that question. We have to make sure we're comparing apples to apples. So the control part is part of the independent variables that you're setting up so that you're doing apples to apples comparisons.
These steps might sound complicated, but they are consistent from one study to another and have been used for centuries. They're meant to protect a study from the biases every researcher has and to ensure that study results and conclusions are reliable and that we've accurately answered the questions we're pursuing. That said, scientific research is not about following recipes. As we will see, every research question is unique and requires its own approach.